All right, the meeting is now being recorded, and it's an audio and a visual recording, so anything you type on the screen will be seen in the recording afterwards. So as I was saying, we're committed to helping build the capacity of diaspora organizations to more effectively achieve their missions, and that's why we're excited to host this webinar on strategic planning with our stellar partners who sort of converge on our interests with volunteerism and capacity building. Cuso International is an international development organization that works to reduce poverty and inequality through the efforts of skilled volunteers. Accenture Federal Services is a global consulting company helping nonprofit organizations, governments, and private sector companies maximize their performance and achieve their visions. This webinar is just one of several capacity building trainings that IDEA will host in the coming months. And to learn more about these, you can visit our website, which is www.diasporaalliance.org. So today's webinar has two central goals. The first is for listeners to gain an understanding of the Diasporas for Development initiative. And the second one is for listeners to gain an understanding of what strategic planning is. We hope you'll come away from this webinar knowing why it's important for organizations, what the process entails, and what special considerations for diaspora organizations might be. Just quickly, I'd like to give you an overview of the agenda for the webinar. We'll start with an overview of the Diasporas for Development initiative, and then we'll review what strategic planning is. Then we'll look at strategic planning through the lens of the Diasporas for Development program, discuss keys to success, and then hear from a diaspora leader who has undergone the process herself. Glenda Chan has been kind enough to join us from Gawad Kalinda, USA. She is the executive director of that organization and is in the process of going through the Diasporas for Development program. Because of the large number of participants on this webinar, all microphones will be on mute, but we'll take questions at the end through the messaging function, which some of you are using already. Finally, we'll share some resources for local nonprofits who want to engage in strategic planning. Don't worry if you miss anything during the presentation. We'll make it available after the webinar. And with that, I'll turn it over to Malika Walton, who's the Senior Officer for Programs and Partnerships at Cuso International.
Joining us. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for your patience and for joining our session today. I wanted to just give you an overview of the Diaspora for Development program, which was started 2 years ago. It's a 2-year public-private partnership between Accenture, USAID, and Cuso International, coming out of the Global Development Alliance of USAID and U.S. State Department, which is really focused on engaging diaspora in development overseas. The goal, overall arching premise of our project was to engage diaspora in development projects to begin to explore avenues for alleviating brain drain from various countries. And we basically had two approaches, two major segments of our program. One was our relationship with U.S.-based diaspora organizations to support their capacity and to build up their capacity to support their initiatives supporting development in their countries. And those countries are Jamaica, the Philippines, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Peru. In addition, we were recruiting 40 American professionals, so skilled individuals from the diaspora, to share their skills with our local partners in those countries that we just mentioned, the 5 target countries. Within this overall project, as I said, we have those 2 major activities. Our goals for the project were to was an economic development overarching theme of helping economic development in those countries. And we had 4 major objectives, as you see here, to increase the capacity of the 5 diaspora partner organizations, to develop and strengthen linkages with those 5 DPOs amongst us, and also to support their ability to promote diaspora engagement in their countries of origin. To also, as we mentioned, sending 40 skilled volunteers to the countries of origin, and our volunteer lengths ranged, the average was 3 or 4 months. We had some people stay as long as 9 months. And then also to evaluate and report on some of the assumptions that had been talked about in the development world about the importance of diaspora engagement in development in the home countries. And so we're in the process right now of collating those results, and we'll be talking about them in the coming months, which is one of the reasons why we're having this webinar. And finally, another important aspect of our project was e-volunteering and e-mentoring, where we have engaged the 40 volunteers after they finished their in-country placement. They were also involved in e-volunteering to continue to support the organization they worked with in country, or to work with maybe another organization that needed some continued assistance. And then we've also tried to engage other people from the diaspora, maybe not able to travel, to engage in e-volunteering. What I'd like to do now is introduce the 5 diaspora partner organizations that were selected to participate in this project. We had a criteria that we worked on between USAID, Cuso, and Accenture. Some of the important aspects of those criteria were that they were organizations that we'd already selected the countries, but that had very positive relationships already with both the U.S. and in their home countries. They also were nonpartisan, as well as having their nonprofit status already in the United States. And so these 5 organizations that were selected to participate in DFD, they're listed here on the sides. And as we said, we're going to hear from Kalinga USA today. Glenda is joining us. The other organizations that were in our project were Society of Ethiopians established in the Diaspora, for SEED, representing Ethiopia, the Institute of Caribbean Studies, ICS, representing Jamaica and the Caribbean as a whole, Partners of the Americas, the Texas chapter of Partners of the Americas. They do work both in Peru and Mexico, and we were focused in Peru, and also Startup Africa, which is a U.S.-based organization working on entrepreneurship in Kenya. With that, I would like to turn the floor over to Krista, as Krista will talk about the strategic planning process.
Great. Thanks, Malika, and hi, folks. This is Krista Sadowski from Accenture, and before I jump in, just want to give a note that because we started late, we'll keep going till about 3:15, 3:20 to give you an honest hour and cover all the content we had, but if you do need to drop at 3 o'clock, that is just fine, and we are recording so you can catch the end at a later date. And then lastly, I think a lot of folks have found the chat box, and feel free to be typing your questions in as we go. I'll address what I can if I can right in the moment without getting too sidetracked, and then we'll certainly open it up for a formal Q&A at the end and cover as many questions as we can at the end. So feel free to use that box as we go. Great. So just to pick her up right where Malika left off here, as part of the Diasporas for Development initiative, the Diaspora Partner Organizations, or DPOs as I'll refer to them from here on out, each went through a 5-phase capacity building process. And strategic planning was one piece of this process for all of the organizations. The DPOs are now in kind of the final 2 phases, so in implementation and working to set up their monitoring and evaluating systems as they move forward. And I will certainly try to slow down here. I had a little too much coffee today. So looking next here, as a part of the capacity building process, each of the DPOs received a combination of deliverables. And this was really based on their needs and how much time they had and where they were in their own maturity as an organization. But as a part of this, each organization did go through a strategic planning process. And the reason that each organization went through a strategic planning process was really threefold. One, none of the organizations that we worked with had an existing comprehensive strategic plan in place. So it was a really quickly identified need. Two, really based on where the organization was looking to go, it became evident very quickly that a strategic plan would be a really useful and effective tool to help them get there. And then three, based on kind of what we know about organizational development, particularly for nonprofit organizations, but for organizations more broadly, the strategic plan really serves as the cornerstone of the organization from which everything else flows. So before we could really get to even talking about organizational structure, programs, or fundraising, we really needed to spend some time clarifying who and what the organizations were and what they were working to achieve. So for example, if you think about going out and trying to raise money and do a donor pitch, if you have a really hard time articulating what your organization's mission is and what your approach to achieving that mission is, it's going to be really hard to convince somebody that they should be donating. And we heard this kind of over and over again of, we're doing a lot of stuff, we're really passionate about it, but we're having a hard time succinctly communicating what it is we're trying to achieve and how we're going to achieve it. So taking kind of pause to organize thoughts, get it on paper, stack hands as an organization, and have a really succinct way of telling the organization's story of who they were and what they were going to achieve and how they were going to achieve it became a really critical ingredient to really move the rest of the organization forward. So as you can see here in this slide, kind of looking at theory of change, board structure relates very quickly to the strategic plan. So when you're recruiting your board members, you know that that needs to relate back to, as you're recruiting board members, you need to be able to tell them what they're actually going to be participating in and what the expectations of them are going to be. So what their role as a board member will really be based on what that strategic plan looks like. Additionally, how you structure your organization will again tie back to your strategic plan, what you're trying to achieve and how you plan to achieve it, what your approach is. And then finally, from there, your organization structure informs how you're going about fundraising, doing your programs and events and actual mission delivery, and how you're delivering your services. So as you can kind of see here, at the end of the day, it all ties back to the strategic plan. And for each of the organizations that we've worked with as a part of this initiative, getting that cornerstone in place became a really critical component. So that really sums up the high-level overview of the Diasporas for Development initiative. We'll move on now to speaking briefly just at a high level of what is strategic planning so that we're all starting from a similar understanding of that definition. And then we'll move into talking about what the strategic planning process for the Diasporas for Development initiative looked like. This was a process that was really tailored to the needs of diaspora groups in particular, so hope to pass on some of the lessons that we learned along the way and really make this a relevant presentation for you all. Great. So what is a strategic plan? I saw from the poll we took at the beginning that folks have kind of a base level of understanding, but just good to kind of stack hands and make sure we're all starting from the same point here. So a strategic plan, as I mentioned before, it really is the cornerstone of an organization from which all your initiatives, programs, activities flow from. If you can't tie it back to the strategic plan, it's probably a really good indication that it's out of scope for your organization and you probably should not be doing it. If you can tie it back to your strategic plan, it's a really good indication that you're on track, and that's a place where your organization certainly should be spending time. So a strategic plan is usually a living document that gets updated about every 3 to 5 years, depending on the organization. Younger organizations tend to look a little bit shorter term, and as you mature as an organization and have the capacity to look further down the road, those can tend to be 5 or even sometimes 10-year plans, but with regular checks built into them, so it's getting updated on a regular basis. It's not an operating plan. So your strategic plan encompasses kind of what your organizational purpose is, what your mission is, what your goals and objectives are, but it doesn't fully get into when and how you're going to execute on that. So the operational planning piece is a really essential piece to follow on the strategic planning. That strategic plan comes first. So then the big question is really, why do it, and what is it going to take to execute this? this was a really tough conversation for a lot of our organizations. And I think this is really common for small to medium-sized organizations when you sense that there's such a big need out there on the ground. You're going 100 million miles an hour trying to deliver on your mission and serve your community. And to talk about taking pause and taking time out to do something as administrative feeling as strategic planning is a really tough thing to wrestle with when you're resource constrained. But what we really found is that without taking the time to align as an organization with some of our clients here and on other engagements, we find that folks tend to kind of be running in a million different directions with a lot of heart and a lot of passion, but sometimes not aligned always to the same approach or purpose. And that's where a lot of burnout comes from. Certainly, before I came to Accenture, I was working in the nonprofit space for many years, and that's where I would always kind of struggle of we've got so many people that are so passionate about what they're doing. We're all working above and beyond our normal 9 to 5 hours to execute and deliver our services and our mission. But sometimes we go in the wrong direction because we haven't taken the time at the beginning to know exactly where we're going to go or where we're trying to go and how we're going to get there. So really, I think that's my my big argument for why taking this time out is important, but really want to acknowledge that it does feel it's challenging because it does take time. So if we look at kind of what are the resources and capabilities required, certainly estimating the amount of time that it'll take is really important for your staff time, your member time, thinking about what stakeholders need to be involved, knowing that this isn't something that can be done in a back office somewhere by one person, that you really need folks from across the organization to have all those voices from your founders, your board members, your volunteers, to make sure that their voices and visions are included in the strategic plan, and that once it's complete, there's no surprises. And since you've brought everybody along in the process, that hopefully everybody is really bought into the plan and can move forward together to start achieving that mission. So in terms of other resources that are needed, certainly some strategic planning know-how. This isn't an area of expertise that we're all born with, so either having that in-house or outsourcing it, which is what our Diaspora for Development partners did. So Accenture really acted as the facilitator and provided kind of a framework, and then the organizations really did the work and generated all the content, and then our role was to kind of compile and reflect back to them what we heard coming out of those meetings. So that was just one approach to bring that strategic planning know-how to the table. Certainly a project manager is needed, somebody that's going to organize the organization, set up meetings, make sure that board members know where they need to be, when they need to be there, and members are present at the right times. And then a facilitator, and again, this facilitator can be the project manager, it can be somebody else, it can be somebody within the organization or outside the organization. Oftentimes we find, especially in diaspora organizations where it tends to be a very tight-knit community, where there's a lot of relationships that are really a part of the fabric of that community, it can be hard to be both a friend, a partner in the organization, and the facilitator. So sometimes it is easier if that facilitator is somebody from outside the community that can understand your needs, but doesn't have the same relationship capital at stake throughout the process and can kind of ask the tough questions when they need to be asked. We talked about stakeholder involvement and staff time, and then funding. Funding for either bringing in some outside support, funding for bringing your groups together to convene and meet, if you're an organization that does better meeting in person versus virtually, and those different pieces. In terms of duration can really vary depending on kind of the structure of your organization. If you're a full-time, fully professionalized organization with a full-time paid staff that has the capacity to have a full-time project manager and be doing multiple meetings a week during the day with follow-up, this process can go pretty quickly. It can be achieved in about a month or two. If it is a volunteer organization, and this is all happening in above and beyond time outside of your normal 9-to-5 jobs, and not a lot of time to do homework or follow-up in between, this process can take many months, as we'll hear about from GKUSA. So it really just depends on your organizational setup, the number of stakeholders you have involved. Obviously, the more people involved, the longer it will take, but getting that buy-in is really critical and worth it. And then kind of your strategic planning capabilities. How much of this are you figuring out as you go versus, if you've been through this process before, it will go a lot faster. And how complex is your organization? If you're a newer, younger organization, this will move pretty quickly because there's less complexity potentially. If you're a very multidimensional, older organization, there's more aspects of the strategic plan that need to be covered. So all this said, between the requirements and the duration, I certainly hope that I haven't scared you off already, because I think it's really important to focus back on what those benefits are. And just a reminder that by having a unified vision and mission, being able to define how you're going to achieve your mission, what your approach is really empowering for an organization. I got not at all scared here, I'm glad. It provides you a really clear roadmap for what's in scope. What do you say yes to as an organization, and what do you say no to? We heard over and over and over again that there's such a tremendous amount of need out there in each of your diaspora communities, and such huge hearts and passion to be of service that it's so easy just to say yes, yes, yes. But kind of one of the trickle-on effects of that is when you say yes, 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 and you have limited resources, making sure that you're still able to achieve your core mission. That if you've gone off on all these side projects from saying yes because you want to be of service, that at the end of the day, you've taken all your time and all your other resources away from your core mission delivery, and you end up failing in that respect. So by having the strategic plan in place, it really provides you that clear roadmap of what do we say yes to and what do we say no to, and learning that it is okay to say no. And saying no is not just have to be a no, but it's looking at who can we partner with that can provide the services that are outside of our scope, or who can we refer to that provides these other services. We know that being all things to all people, as much as our hearts want to say yes, is not sustainable as an organization. So that strategic plan really helps provide focus so you can excel at your core mission and become really strong and stable as an organization down the road. Lastly, the benefits are, it's not just an internal document, it really serves externally. It allows you to communicate to external parties who you are and how you'll achieve your mission. So that last piece there is really critical as well, and a key benefit. Great. So that's kind of our 101 of what is a strategic plan, what to expect in terms of resources required, duration, and benefits. I'm going to shift gears now to talking about what the strategic planning process looks like for our diaspora partner organizations. At a high level, this was a 7-phase process that took place as a part of the broader capacity building process that I spoke of before. And the steps listed here are fairly equivalent to what you'd see for any kind of organization, diaspora or non-diaspora. But what we did was really tailor the approach that we took at achieving each of these steps to the particular needs of our diaspora organizations. So we'll take them one at a time and go into a little bit more detail of how that was tailored and what that looked like. So the first step really looked at assessing the current state. And this is another step, like the strategic planning of going, we just want to get to the end, we just want to get to the end, we want to start achieving mission, and it's challenging to find the patience to take pause and look at where you are today when all you want to be doing is moving forward. And I really acknowledge the desire to move forward, and that this can be a very challenging stage for any organization. But it's really important to know where you are today before you can figure out where you want to go and really how you'll get there. If you think you're at step 5 and you want to get to step 10, but you're really already at step 7 and you just need to get to step 10, those paths will look really different. So having an accurate understanding of where you are today is really essential. So to conduct the current state assessment, what we did was collected a variety of inputs. We conducted interviews with stakeholders at all levels of the organization, from board members down on through to very, very part-time volunteers to hear their perspectives. We conducted surveys and focus groups. We did a variety of media, so in person, over the phone, Google Doc surveys, all sorts of things, as well as doing some market research. So it was really important to understand where your organization is in the broader context. Are there 5 other diaspora organizations that are doing the exact same thing as you, or are you the only one in the marketplace serving that particular need? And that just having that understanding helps you understand kind of how big the need is that you're trying to serve and who else you can either partner with to ensure that you're not duplicating efforts or learn from as a peer organization, or if you really are a sole player in that space. The next piece of the current state assessment included a special capacity assessment scorecard that we developed particularly for our set of diaspora organizations, and it assessed them across these 10 competency areas listed here. And what we found was that the 5 organizations that we worked with were all at a relatively similar stage in organizational maturity, kind of within the same cohort, if you will, or age bracket, when I talk about organizational maturity, and that these 10 areas were really critical catalysts to helping them be able to move forward. So it was really important to understand in depth, in particular, how they were performing in these areas, and then what their improvability score was. So how easy it would be to kind of get quick wins in these areas versus what the, if there was a bigger level of investment needed to move them forward. After understanding where the organization was today, we moved towards defining the future state. And we did this by hosting a visioning session for each organization. And usually this took the form of a day-long in-person meeting where folks would come in from all over the country for regional or national organizations, or from the respective regions for regional organizations. It varied greatly depending on the culture of the organization and where they were in their own internal processes. So for Gawad Kalinga, we'll be hearing from Glenda later on, their organizational culture loves to do really long days and get it all done at once. For one of our other partners, we split it across 2 days, knowing that just their way they work is better in really shorter half-day concentrated sessions, and really tailored the agenda accordingly. So as a part of these sessions, we shared the findings from the current state assessment, did a series of exercises to help vision where the organization wanted to go and build a collective vision. And that was really important, that it wasn't just one person's vision dictating where the organization would go, but that it was a collective vision to help move the organization forward. Then from there, we started thinking about prioritizing, so understanding where we were, where they wanted to go, and looking at the gap in between. So from there, started building a roadmap. What were the key capabilities that they would need to develop to enable them to get to where they wanted to be in the future? And what I mean by key capabilities is what are the organizational kind of health features that they needed? Was it organizational structure? Was it updating how their board was supporting the organization? Or was it a strategic planning process? And typically we found it was a combination of things, but that a strategic plan was a critical component of that. From the visioning session, we then moved into launching the strategic planning process and actually developing the plan. And so this was a very involved 12-step process that started with preparation. So what do you mean by preparation? Haven't we already taken many, many steps to get there already? But at this point, this is where the project manager role really came into play here. So defining kind of what the scope of the strategic plan would be. Strategic plans can be anything from 1 page to 300 pages. So looking at how much time we had, making a collective decision on how deep and detailed we wanted to go in the process, creating kind of the template that we would be working to fill in, so knowing what kind of information we needed to gather. And then outlining the meeting schedule and the types of working sessions that we would need to have to get the information we needed to develop the plan. In this stage 2, in stage 2, you needed to figure out who needed to be at the table for these discussions. what stakeholders, whether that be board members, part of our directorate, general membership or volunteers, or even just advisors that might not be active members of the organization but might be able to add some great perspectives. So figuring out who needed to be at what meetings and establishing working groups to take on specific pieces of the strategic plan. From there, we really dug in phase 3 or step 3 and conducted these meetings. In stage 4, we really worked to articulate first the organizational purpose. And this was kind of a fun process because this was something that everybody, and very common across a lot of kind of small to medium nonprofits, that everybody has in their own mind a really clear sense of what that organization's purpose is, why it exists, and how they achieve that mission. But when everybody comes together in the room, oftentimes you hear a lot of dissonance and very different descriptors. So it was really important to get everybody at the table at the same time to collectively stack hands on what that would look like. Similarly, as a lot of the organizations that we were working with were really in a transition stage from going from being what I'll call kind of new organizations, 100% volunteer run, to starting to think about professionalizing a little bit and having some paid support staff either on a part-time or a couple on a full-time basis, and really looking to grow. So as they were kind of at this transition stage, moving from one stage of maturity to the next, it was a really important time to revisit their mission and vision statements. So was mission and was the vision statements, were they still current for the organization? And if not, as often happens with young organizations in your early stages, as you're finding your feet, you're finding your niche, that those needed to be refreshed and clarified. Finally, or not finally, but in the next step, in step 6, we moved on to developing the strategic goals. And the goals are something that are more temporary. So your vision and mission statements are typically consistent over the lifetime of the organization and kind of only updated at key transition periods, whereas your goals are typically in place for 3 to 5 years, and next year objectives that you develop are really how you're going to go about achieving that goal. So shorter term and really only around for the life of that particular strategic plan. Next up, in step 8, was digging even deeper and getting more specific. So defining the actual kind of projects and activities that would need to be undertaken by the organization to achieve each of those objectives. And defining roadmaps, kind of high-level work plans for how those projects would be carried out. And then finally figuring out how are we going to measure success? How will we know if we're on track, we're falling behind, or if we've exceeded what we've set out to do in terms of achieving those individual objectives? So really clearly defining that. The next stage was the fun stage of bringing it all together and compiling it into a single document so that it was a really usable document. And then in the next stage, it was really important to kind of take pause and recognize that we'd gotten this compiled full product and bring it back to the board of directors, even though a lot of them had been involved in the process throughout, but to get their sign-off and final approval. From there, the strategic plan was approved with updates after that we'd gotten their feedback in step 10. And then in step 12, the really exciting part began, moving towards implementation. So I'm going to jump to this next slide here, and I'll just spend a very brief second here, just a good working definition of what kind of vision and mission are. There's very good formulas for how to construct a strong vision and mission statement, and a lot of good resources out there online, and we'll share some at the end of the presentation as well. And then just a good definition of goals and objectives. And this presentation will be sent out afterwards, so it's kind of just a good little template, work template for you all to use. Next up, I think this is just a great visual to kind of show how all the pieces of the strategic plan fit together. So at the very top, of course, is your organization's vision. In a utopian society, what would your organization like that to look like? Then your mission. How is your particular organization going to contribute to achieving this vision? So if the vision is a world without war, your mission would then explain how your particular organization was going to approach contributing to creating a world without war. Your goals then, as I mentioned, are more temporary, so kind of on that 3 to 5 year basis, they would get updated. But looking kind of at the next 3 years of this organization, what are our goals and what are we going to focus on here? So that might be increasing our donor base. It could be around programs. It could be around volunteer engagement. The list goes on. And then breaking down each of those goals into individual objectives. Typically, again, depending on how detailed of a strategic plan you're doing, but anywhere from 1 to 10 objectives per goal. 10 is getting pretty detailed. At the end of the day, wanting to keep it high, or not high level, but simple enough that it's a really digestible document is important as well, especially for kind of our small to medium-sized organizations. From there, building out performance measures for each of the objectives, again, so you can kind of track your projects. Strategies and actions, how are you actually going to achieve each of your objectives? And then your success factors, what's it going to take to be successful with each of these? So this is just a great kind of framework, seeing it all on a page. And then you can kind of imagine that there would be a section of your strategic planning document that would go into more detail on each of the sections that we've just discussed. From there, their light is shining very brightly at the end of the tunnel. From here, it's time to bring your compiled, beautiful, glossy strategic plan back to your board and any other key stakeholders before you begin implementation and really get final agreement and buy-in that this is the strategic plan that your organization is going to live by and abide by. This is really what makes or breaks the difference between a strategic plan that sits on a shelf and just collects dust and a strategic plan that really provides a roadmap for an organization. So getting people fully bought into it, they know what it is, they can articulate it themselves, and they believe in where the strategic plan will take them is a really critical step. Similarly, once you have that approval, this is a step that often gets missed, is before you begin implementation, socializing the plan amongst all your key stakeholders. So whether that's, again, the rest of your staff, whether that's paid or volunteer, your folks that are on the ground doing work on a day-to-day basis, all the way down to your kind of more infrequent members, and then, of course, communicating it externally as well. And this part, again, is one of those really simple steps to miss, but is a make or break step, because if folks don't actually know what's in the binder, it's really hard for them to act in alignment of it, and then you really put yourself at risk for continuing to work 100 million miles an hour, but in different directions. So if you can socialize the plan well, it's an incredibly powerful tool for getting all of your forces and energy in your organization moving in the same direction at the same pace, which is really where mission achievement starts to occur. Great. From here, it's time to work the plan. It's actually the exciting stuff comes to life now. So now that you've spent all this time planning, discussing your approach, and figuring out how to move forward with this, it's time to get working. It's a really good time to put together, your operating plans and divvy out to folks that are responsible for different initiatives across your organization and ask them to come back to you with how are you going to achieve your piece of the organization as it relates to the strategic plan. And at the end of the day, just making sure that everything you do aligns to the strategic plan. And if it doesn't, it's a really good reminder to pause and assess whether this is something that your organization should be doing at this stage. And then, of course, the monitoring and evaluation stage. We'll never know if we got there if we don't take time to monitor and evaluate and gauge progress. A lot of times it's by this point we're tired, we don't want to do anything more with paperwork, it's really easy to give up at this stage. But again, another really critical point that makes or breaks whether this is a useful tool or not. It's a good indicator to see if you're not achieving what you thought you set out to achieve, to do a gut check and kind of figure out, look under the hood, see what's not working, see what might be misaligned or what additional support might be needed. And if you are achieving, keep doing what you're doing. And if you're overachieving, again, look under the hood, look what's really working well and see how you can capitalize on those strengths elsewhere across your organization. So just to wrap this up, a couple kind of keys to success that I want to leave you with from this process we found was starting from the beginning. Find the support and the process that's right for your organization. Not all strategic planning processes are created equal. And really what will work for your organization will really vary based on your culture, the amount of time that you have to put into the process, and kind of your existing capabilities. I would offer that you don't have to do this alone, that there's a lot of great resources, whether that's bringing in an outside facilitator or just getting some online resources to support your process. But finding the right tools and process for your organization is really critical. Next, know the investment. I know Glenda will have some great comments to share with us about this in a minute, but just going into this eyes wide open that a strategic plan is not just given to you. It's a really active, all-involved process that will involve folks from every corner of your organization and will take a lot of active discussion, coming together as a community and looking in the mirror and reflecting on who we are and really where we want to go. So it's a very active and involved and engaged process. It does take an investment of time and resources. But with that said, believe in the benefits. Know that this is an investment that while it's challenging to kind of take pause and take time out from your current mission delivery, will ultimately enable you to go further and faster and get there with more smiles on your face. So that it really is time well spent and helps you become a more efficient and effective organization and ultimately serve more people, or excuse me, maximize your mission impact and do more of what you want to do. Number 4, again, just knowing where you are today before you plan for the future. It's a critical step. It's one that's really easy to skip over, but knowing that that's a really important one to take pause for because it sets the foundation for the rest of the plan. 5, getting the right people to the table. There's nothing worse than going through an exhaustive strategic planning process only to get to the end and realize that you didn't have the right people at the table and it's just impossible to achieve buy-in and organizational alignment, and so that you really can't move forward. So again, taking that time at the beginning to think about who all needs to be involved, making sure that you've got voices represented from kind of all cross-sections of your organization, and then being able to move forward with confidence that the organization is well represented in the process. And then finally, 6, work the plan. There's nothing worse than a strategic plan that sits on a shelf. And if it does sit on the shelf, it's probably a good indication that it hasn't actually been, didn't hit the mark for the needs of the organization. So make sure that you develop a plan that will be a living, breathing document, that will be updated regularly, that will be referred to regularly, and really does act as kind of that tree trunk or cornerstone of the organization. So with that, I will actually pause here. Malika, is there anything else that you wanted to add on that note before we jump to Gawad Kalinga?
I thought maybe before we hear some comments from Glenda, that you could also talk a little bit about 1 or 2 thoughts on why this was really unique for diaspora organizations. Accenture does a lot of this type of strategic planning, so what were a couple of the adjustments you all had to make in your process? And then we'll jump into the comments from Glenda.
Great. I don't know if folks could hear that question very well. It was coming on broken up through my mic, but I'm here in the room with Malika, so I'll just repeat that, which was a great question of what was really unique about this experience for diaspora organizations and how did we adjust our process as Accenture that does a lot of this type of work with a range of organizations to fit the needs of diaspora groups, which is a really great question. So I think first and foremost, we were just blown away by the heart and soul of these organizations, just so much energy that was pouring into delivering mission on a daily basis. And one of the blessings and the challenges of that was that it was that much harder to take pause to do a strategic planning process because there was such a deep connection to the sense of need from the community and a desire to be delivering delivering on services and mission every minute of every day. So it was really tough to take pause to do a strategic planning process. I think the second point I would say is we learned a lot about working with organizations that were transitioning from being predominantly volunteer run to starting to think about professionalizing a little bit. And for us at Accenture, that's not our normal clientele. We tend to work with organizations that have more staff that are full-time and can devote their time to a process like this more continuously. So that was a lot of adjustments for us, knowing that we needed to accommodate the schedules of our partners. So that meant having meetings. I think Glenda and I met Tuesday and Thursday evenings from about 8 to 10 for weeks on end, which was just a really different way of working for us. So I think in terms of choosing who's going to support you in your process, if you do decide to pull somebody in from outside, is making sure they understand, you know, your constraints around timing and what your culture is. I think the other piece that we were really just reminded of is how different all the organizations are. And I think Diaspora, every organization has its own culture and its own flavor, but Diaspora organizations particularly, because there's such a strong sense of community and culture that influences what that particular organization looks like, that was really, really left a strong impression, and that every organization needed to work at a different pace, communicated differently, and that some of the normal rules about kind of organizational communication and development didn't always apply. So just knowing that working in a really strong community context, because I would say a lot of these organizations, as you all know all too well, are really communities first and organizations second. So that was a big take home for us. So with that, I will turn it over to Glenda from Glenda Chan, who is one of the organizations that we worked with. She's the executive director for GK USA and did a phenomenal job as the project manager for her organization going through the capacity building process. And we've invited her to share really candidly some of the joys and the pains of this process so that you all can kind of learn vicariously through her. And I've asked her to be really blunt and honest. We've got a great relationship because there were some really shining moments of this process and there were some really challenging moments of this process. And I think it's important to share those as lessons that we can pass on to other organizations. So Glenda?
Hi, does everyone hear me okay? Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you, Glenda.
Yeah. Oh, okay, great. Thanks, Krista, for the great introduction. My name is Glenda Chan. I'm the Executive Director for Gawad Kalinga USA. We are a Filipino, we're basically a Philippine, we are the U.S. representative of a Philippine movement, and Gawad Kalinga, translated to English, simply means to give care. We build our primary goal is to build communities for the poorest of the poor back in the Philippines. Here in Gawad Kalinga USA, we do a lot of things that would basically raise advocacy and pretty much support the movement back home. Why did we decide to undertake a strategic planning process? We have been thinking, myself, I have worked as an administrator at the university for over 10 years, and I've gone through a lot of faculty meetings and retreats and strategic planning, and so I know for a fact that this is something that we need for the organization. The question is how how do we proceed, and do we have resources for it? So by some miracle, Cuso found us. We actually had a global summit. Our Philippine movement had a global summit in Canada, which is the home of Cuso, and so Cuso Canadian representatives connected us with the DC rep, and suddenly we're going through our process of vetting and whether we're going to be the DPO from the Philippines, which we successfully that we vied for and was successful in getting it. I cannot minimize enough let me rephrase that. I cannot tell you enough what a strategic planning process, going through a strategic planning process actually did for the organization. One of the best way to really put it is that it basically provided us with our North Star. And as Krista mentioned earlier, we have buckets now. We basically identify the bucket wherein we can say that, this is something we need to do, as opposed to this is something we want to do. I believe that every one of us would like to basically solve the world's problems, but at some point we can only do so much. So we have to focus on what is the real mission, vision statement of our organization. Now, what is the benefits? Having said that, we went through the process, and lo and behold, it's exactly what we expected, plus more. The benefit that we have gained from the process is that, one, I think we were able to learn more about ourselves as an organization and learn how to differentiate our role here in the U.S. versus our movement's role back in our homeland, which is the Philippines. We don't build communities for the poorest of the poor here in the U.S., but our counterpart in the Philippines do the hard lifting in terms of addressing poverty. So the strategic planning basically allowed us to identify what exactly are our roles here in the U.S. and how we can further support our movement back home. One of the classic examples that I've told Krista is that when Typhoon Haiyan hit the Philippines in November of 2013 and brought about this massive devastation, a lot of people started hearing about us because our group in the Philippines were at the forefront of relief work. And because of the strategic planning, we were able to represent ourselves better. We were able to address and differentiate our roles in the U.S. and how we are actually channeling support from the U.S. to the Philippines so that it will get to the people who need it most. So we're no longer all over the place in terms of defining who we are, because we know exactly who we are here in the U.S. What did it take to do the strategic planning process? It takes a lot of energy, a lot of time, member engagement, regular meetings, but I think the biggest thing is it took a lot of heart, because most of the diaspora organizations I know are volunteer-run and volunteer-based, and we're not any different. And I think without the commitment of people who just wanted to do good and be part of it, it would be very, very hard for us to survive. How long is it, Krista? 10 months? 10 months of discovery, from, defining who we are to identifying what we need to do, and basically defining our roadmap for the following years to come. And the most challenging part of the process really is getting people's commitment is not that hard if you have a really big organization. In our case, we are national here in the U.S., so gathering 10 people on a weekday for 2 hours to respond to some inquiries and assessment may seem to not be a problem, except keeping the same 10 people consistently for 10 months. That's the problem. So that's where I said that having the heart to go through the process is the main criteria in terms of getting committed people to really work together to get it done. There were times when we are down to 3 people on a Tuesday night for 2 to 3 hours even. But I think whoever would be taking the helm as the project manager would just need to know who the right people should be, who the right people to tap into. There was a time when we had 3 or 4, but I was able to put together 3 or 4 people who represent each of the working part of our organization. There was a board member, there was an area leader, there is someone who's just volunteering, and with people who are committed and with good heads over their shoulders, it would actually be enough. So I would just advise people not to get frustrated when those times kind of hit you during the process. And there are other challenges also. I mean, in terms of face-to-face meetings, when we had our visioning, because we are a volunteer-run organization, we don't have an office. We have to kind of identify partners who are willing to give up their basements or their home for one day to accommodate all these gatherings and meetings that we need to do during the process. And
Glenda, thank you so much for...
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Do you want to wrap up?
Okay, and then I think I pretty much said, and then three key pieces of advice that I would just say is that, you know, if you decide to have a strategic planning, you have to make sure that it's really, really what you want, because the process is not simple. What we first thought would be a one-day meeting to get everything done turned out to be a 10-month process that gave us this gem of a gift that allowed us to have our North Star for our future years to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Glenda. This is Sarah. I really appreciate you sharing with us and with everyone on the call your experiences from the ground, what it's really like to do a strategic planning process, how much work it takes, but how rewarding it is in the end. And thank you for sharing that with us. I want to move to some of the Q&A because we're receiving some questions on the board. And it looks like most of them are pertaining to how people can get access to resources for strategic planning and how do they get started. So I've listed some local organizations here. So we're all based, the presenters are based in Washington, D.C. So here are some examples of organizations in our area that have either graduate students or professionals who have been in the field for 20 years doing pro bono strategic planning for organizations. And for these, you have to be a nonprofit organization, and there's an application process, but they provide similar kinds of support as Accenture does with their clients. And one of them actually has a deadline next week, and I'd say that's pretty fast to determine if you want to do a strategic plan and apply. But if this is something you've been considering and you think you're ready, that may be one to check out. The slides will be available afterwards, so you don't have to hurry and copy down the links. We'll send that to you. That's what most people are asking about. Krista, I'm not sure if there's any other source or places you think people can look to find. People are talking about strategic planning templates, or what are your suggestions for folks who want to get started, or maybe just see if they have the capacity to get started?
Sure. Yep, so as I mentioned at the beginning, there is no one way or one right way to do strategic planning, for better or for worse. So I think finding the tools and templates and external support that's right for your organization is really critical. So Compass is a great organization. I'm very familiar with them. They do a lot of great pro bono work. I'm not as familiar with the others here. We will be sending out a recording and the PowerPoint presentation used today, and I would refer you back to the slide that kind of showed vision, mission, goals, and objectives, and kind of how all those pieces fit together. And just that's a really great template to get started and thinking about what categories you need to be working towards. And also, again, great resources online if you're just looking for templates and think that you have the expertise in-house to facilitate the process. But looking to, I think this is actually a really good list of folks if you're looking for some external facilitation support to help guide you through that process. I think I also caught a question about how do you get a sense of community if a diaspora group is disengaged? And I just wanted to touch on this question briefly because I thought it was a really relevant one and one that we've certainly heard a number of times. And what we heard from working kind of both through our selection process of selecting the 5 DPOs that got grants that we did work with, I guess two things. The first, we saw across all of these organizations that we surveyed that the majority of diaspora organizations in the U.S. Are kind of small to medium sized and in their early stages of maturity as organizations. The blessing in that is that there's a lot of green space. There's a high level of need, we know, for these organizations to really grow and step up and fill those needs. The challenge is that as you're looking up as an organization, there are not a lot of role models, organizations that look like you, walk like you, and talk like you to look at as role models for how do we begin this process and how do we develop, what is our organizational development path going to look like? So that's kind of the blessing and the challenge there. So just wanted to acknowledge kind of what the space that we found looks like for diaspora organizations more broadly. And then in terms of that piece around getting a sense of community, this we heard was a big challenge for about 50% of the organizations we talked to. 50% of the organizations, kind of the community was already really there, either because people had migrated to similar locations or because of existing kin networks that were really vital when they came to the States. And basically the organizations had risen out of those kin networks. The other, on the flip side, the other 50% of the organizations that we found as a part of the selection process saw a need and really had to work then to create a sense of understanding of the challenges, a sense of caring for the challenges, and then a sense of community to respond to those challenges. And out of that, the organization was born. So Glenda, actually, I think we'll share that one of their goals for their next strategic plan is actually strengthening the state of their community, that they kind of started as an organization that kind of started from really strong kin networks, but as they've grown in the transition of first generation Filipinos to second generation Filipinos that are a lot less connected to the mother country, that there's all of a sudden a huge issue of disenfranchisement. So really a need to build that sense of community before you can even talk about delivering on mission. I might direct you to reach out to Glenda and to see what kind of lessons could be learned from their process, but that is a really, really common challenge, and just bringing people to the table and getting them excited about the mission is often that first step, and is a really valuable strategic planning goal. Other questions?
Hi, this is Malaika.
Oh, Malaika's just signing on here.
Hi, this is Malaika from Cuso International. We had one question that was talking about how did the diaspora organizations we were involved with, how do they communicate with their home country? And I want to stress that each country that we were working with has a very different government structure, NGO structure, and also relationship with the diaspora. So I think each country was very individual in that. From Cuso's perspective, I will say that we were working through offices, either with Cuso or with our major volunteering partners, and that we had direct relationships with NGOs and sometimes government organizations in those 5 countries. And so we were able to, through our offices in those countries, be able to talk about what the volunteer opportunities would be. And then each organization each organization that we were dealing with in the U.S. would also have relationships with either other NGOs in that country or possibly with the government, but mainly with kind of partner organizations. I think one of the greatest examples is Partners of the America, which is throughout the U.S. and Latin and Central America. And so Texas Partners of the America has this umbrella organization of Partners of America, and then there are chapters in, for example, Peru as well. So that is kind of an extreme example of how there's already a network where they're able to collaborate and organize locally. From Cuso's perspective, we actually have offices and we deal with NGOs in those countries through which we send our skilled volunteers. I know it's getting late and many people want to leave. If Glenda is still with us, she might also want to talk about one question we have on communication, and then somebody asked about the challenges in implementation, and maybe Glenda could provide one comment on the biggest challenge in implementing the strategic plan that they may be facing.
Regarding that question with communication of with our home organization, what we actually have a direct communication line with one person in the Philippines. They have the Philippine structure allowed one of their staff to respond directly to GKUSA inquiries and requests for information. And at the same time, depending on the questions that we have here in the U.S., we are given access to project directors, area coordinators in the Philippines, where we have where our projects, where the projects that we support are located. One thing that I would sort of caution everyone, especially those who are, especially diaspora organizations who are working with their country counterpart that's not as organized as we are here in the U.S., is that sometimes it would take for us to define to them what would work for us, but considering the culture and the limitation of our counterparts back home. So I guess it's still a work in progress. We're still trying to find that comfortable middle ground on to make sure that we get the information exchange that we need. Did that answer your question? What's the other question,
yes,
Malaika?
Thanks.
Okay.
It was about your biggest
question,
challenge.
As far as
in the whole process, what was in implementing the strategic plan?
Oh, the implementation. Yeah, you know what? The biggest challenge, really, especially for volunteer-based or volunteer-run organization, is finding the commitment of people who would actually, take the strategic plan and bring it to the next level. Right now, we have transitioned from purely volunteer-based to providing nominal stipends to some of our key volunteers. So you would be surprised how much, a couple of hundreds can do for a person in terms of getting more output and commitment, because at least they don't have to worry about, eating or spending gas if they have to travel and meet their groups. So implementation-wise, I think the challenge there really is time commitment of people. At the same time, identifying key people who would actually develop the content of the strategic plan. Because as Krista said, it's not an operational plan. It's not a template. It's not a manual that you can just read and then execute. You still have to develop your activities. You still have to develop your programs. And once you develop that, that's what you bring to your folks on the ground. So that's been one of the biggest challenge, actually. But at least what the strategic plan has provided is a guide. It's a roadmap on what you need to do, and differentiating it from a list of things to do. So those are two things that people have to recognize once you actually have your strategic plan.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Glenda. It really means a lot to hear it from an organization who's working through the process now. We've had some really great questions and a really engaged audience, but we're far out of time. So I'd like to wrap up the webinar now and say thank you again to all of our partners on the call, Krista from Accenture, Malaika from Cuso International, and Glenda from GKUSA. Thank you so much for your time and sharing with us some of the challenges and benefits and what to look for when strategic planning. Again, this webinar the recording and the slides will be available to registered participants after the call, and we'll also send a survey to follow up and find out what kinds of training and capacity building seminars our diaspora groups are interested in. So thank you, everyone, and stay tuned for more from us.